Well, we've got some challenges in the readings today. I can't help but begin with the letter of James, in which seemingly we are told that people who come well-dressed to church better watch out. I want to share a story about seating and preferred seating in Episcopal churches based on who you are. Tim and I one year went up to Newport, and on Sunday we went to the Episcopal church there, Trinity, a beautiful colonial church in Newport. Trinity has, as many colonial churches did, box pews in that pattern that came from that tradition of several centuries ago. And also in the tradition of Episcopal churches up until the 20th century, people paid rentals for pews. And often your name was put on the pew, and that pew is what you paid your rent for. Well, that was certainly true at Trinity. And although that practice had stopped, the names were still there. And we were shown by the ushers to a box pew, and very prominently the box pew said Vanderbilt. So I turned to the usher and I said, well, what happens if the Vanderbilts come? And he said, you'll know it. They didn't. And then I want to look at the gospel. Just a reminder, St. Mark is the earliest gospel that we have, probably written by someone who actually had known or was almost a contemporary of Jesus. So Mark is the shortest gospel, and in many ways the most direct in the way that it portrays Jesus. It's a very early gospel, in contrast to John, that's much later. And there are differences in the Gospels, as there are in all the Gospels. But always one theme in all the Gospels is the proclamation of good news, which is what gospel means. Now, that interpretation of what good news is always different between the people that write it. When I was at Church of the Messiah in Rhinebeck on Sunday mornings, I'd drive down Route 9 from our house, and I would pass a fundamentalist church on the way who had a digital signboard out on the road, and they would say what the sermon was for that day on their signboard. And I remember one Sunday driving past, and it said in big bold letters, "Sin is a black hole in the middle of your heart." And under that said, "Come hear the good news." I couldn't help but think, if that's the good news, what's the bad news? So today's Gospel of Mark, which I find profoundly moving, and I'll tell you why. I think it contains a piece of very important, if not somewhat controversial, good news. It has the story that opens with Jesus' interaction and conversation with the woman who is from Assyrian and from Phoenicia. So she was born in Phoenicia and Carthage in Africa, and now lives in Syria. So she's the Syro-Phoenician woman in the gospel. And Mark makes very clear that she is a Gentile. And Jesus is in a home, presumably about to share a meal with Jewish friends, disciples. And this woman has heard of Jesus' reputation as a healer. So she comes and petitions Jesus to help her daughter, her beloved daughter, who is seized by a demon. And then Jesus' response. Jesus says to her, "I'm not here for you, I'm here for the Jewish people." And it's very clear that Jesus brushes her off and says, it is for the children of God, in Jewish understanding, to be fed first, not the dogs. This is a very insulting moment in the gospel. it's discomforting to hear Jesus say this. So discomforting that if you want a couple of hours of amusing time, look at the commentaries that try to make this okay. Jesus didn't really mean to call her a dog. He was actually inviting her into the household where dogs had a place. Not what the text says. And also, we all love our dogs, so it doesn't seem like two terrible things to say. But in the time that Jesus is living, it's a terrible thing to say. And the woman answers Jesus back, has the courage to say, well, even the dogs get the crumbs left when everyone else has eaten. And what I want to make a case for, just in terms of interpretation, is not that we have to make this gospel safe to be able to be heard, but be willing to wrestle with the text in what it means and what it says. And of course, the good news for Episcopalians is no one has a monopoly on that interpretation. There are people who believe that Jesus is formed from birth until death to be perfect. Perfect in everything that he does and says. And the biggest proponent of this view of Jesus is the writer of John's Gospel, in which Jesus is always all-knowing and perfect. Mark, however, portrays a Jesus that is more complicated than that, because Mark is willing to juggle the human and the divine that exists in Jesus. We're told that our Messiah, the Son of God, is both human and divine. But the church has been most comfortable looking at the divine nature of Jesus and not necessarily the human nature of Jesus. And I'd make the case that this is a very human moment. Jesus is speaking out of his context as a Jew of that time, out of his tradition and culture, where people who worship the one God were the true believers, and the others were in error, misbegotten, misguided. Jesus says those words to the woman out of his understanding of the world as a faithful Jew of the time. And it's worthwhile mentioning that I think that's a sign of good news, and I'll tell you why. Because I find it easier and comforting to have a Messiah that is fully human as well as divine. For me, a Jesus that had to struggle sometimes, or to listen and to grow in understanding, gives me the comfort to know that in my struggles, I can identify with Jesus in his. And so for me, this is a moment of Jesus struggling with the context of his faith and a real person in front of him. And the good news is that Jesus listens to her. He does not continue to dismiss her, but instead does exactly what her heart, what her love as a mother demanded, and that is, her daughter is healed. It's a powerful moment in the gospel precisely because it is Jesus listening anew to someone in his presence. And for me, there's an ongoing struggle to listen, to understand, to battle against the context of my own beliefs or perhaps prejudices. We all have them. we all feel more comfortable with people that look and act and believe in the same things that we do. But the message that Jesus hears in this interaction is looking past that discomfort that is felt when someone outside interacts with us, and to listen and be willing to change. Now, the idea of Jesus changing is very controversial in itself. A lot of commentators throw the wonderful word of heresy around as soon as that's mentioned. And I say, bring it on. Because for me, again, it's that profoundly human moment of invitation to a deeper relationship with each other in our understanding and our belief in God. I don't think it takes anything away from Jesus' divinity to be able to interact with people in a truly human way. And you know, the context of the things in my life that cause me to be prejudicial, to rely on assumptions or appearances, is very pervasive in my thinking. And I try to battle with it, I try to learn, but it's an ongoing process. But I take comfort and strength in knowing that the person I believe to be the Son of God also struggled to understand things more fully. For me, it is good news. And lest we think that this is not what this gospel's about, Mark, as a brilliant editor, throws the second part of the gospel in, which is about listening and speaking and being open. In the second healing story, Jesus immediately in Mark gets up from this healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter and goes to another Gentile region. And here he's met by a man who is deaf with a speech impediment, who desires healing. And Jesus, without question, no banter here, no questioning of Jewish credentials, he just heals him because that's what the man needs. And that's the sign of God's love, is Jesus' willingness to be open, inclusive, accepting, and therefore the Son of God. None of us will ever do it as Jesus was able to be, in the way that he was open, but we can participate in how he got there. Each of us, using the model of Jesus, has a path and a way to be our better selves, to do exactly what James in his letter talks about, which is not just what we say in our faith, but actually what we do. And changing what we do is hard, and it's a process. But it first of all depends upon listening, which Jesus does and models for us in this gospel. And then what's wonderful is Jesus' command, be open. Of course, he's talking about the healing of this man's hearing and his speech, but it's also more than that. It's a reminder for us to remain open to the way that God is revealed, not in perfection, but in the ways that we struggle together as a people. To do God's work, to follow God's command, and to be beacons and signs of God's forgiving, open love for all of humanity. Amen.